Welcome to the God is Not an Asshole podcast. If you are one of the many people done with religious dogmatism, hang on. You might sense transcendence, but your church or other faith community never seem to get off the ground. You realize that honoring your conscience means more than fitting in and keeping hard-to-explain rules? Hang on. You could probably think of the goodness in your tradition, and you tried your best to save that baby, but there's so much bathwater. Join your hosts, David Norman Moore Jr. in California and Carrie Connolly in New Jersey, who are collaborating to bring on guests who have found life on the other side of fundamentalism. Guests with stories of how they have liberated themselves from beliefs that divide us from each other. None of our guests' narratives are identical, but we hope you'll find something in common with each of them. We invite you to experience our common bond as we all inspire even more of us to embrace the true self.
So everybody, we are listening to the delightful Kat Armas, Cuban American writer and speaker and host of the Protagonistas podcast, and specifically the author of Abuelita Faith, What Women on the Margins Teach Us About Wisdom, Persistence, and Strength. Now, just now, you used multiple times the word resistance. So I would like to ask you, Kat, is there something that you have discovered, something that you've come across to help us, to help empower us to that place of bold resistance, of being free from an obligation to a system of domination? I'm thinking of a quote by the late Stephen Biko, the South African resistor. And he said, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. What have you found to awaken us?
Yeah, that's so good. So one of my favorite post-colonial thinkers, his name is Walter Mignolo, and he says that, he's in conversation with De Sousa Santos, and he says that in order to see social justice in our world, we need to, we need to focus, we need to pay attention to cognitive justice. And I love this idea. And I bring this up because of this quote that you read, the mind of the oppressor. And I think that in order to decolonize, or in order to divest from colonial ways of being and knowing, I think we need to allow ourselves to understand and be awakened to other ways of being and knowing in the world. And by that, I just mean that there are other ways that people across time and across history have made meaning of their existence, right? We see this in, indigenous spaces. We see this in spaces, in colonized spaces, of how knowing comes up in so many different ways. How do people know? And in Abuelita Faith, I ask, what is wisdom? Who is wise? Who gets to say who is wise? Who gets to say what wisdom is, right? And we've been told in white evangelicalism and just in the Western world, who to look for wisdom. Who has, it's those with the degrees in the pulpits and the suits and, the white men who tell us, who is wise and what wisdom is. And so I think that in order to establish cognitive justice, in order to, sort of see a way forward in these decolonizing efforts, we need to, what are the other ways that people across the globe be and know, right? And so that's why in Abuelita Faith, I talk about all of these bodily ways of being and knowing, how, folks across the globe have understood themselves and their faith and their community in ways that don't just have to do, that have to do with the mind, of course, because, but the whole body, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that it involves really just a bodily knowing and leading into all the different ways that we can understand God, all the different ways that we can experience the divine, all the different ways that we can experience liberation through the divine. And I think that involves using our bodies, and that involves using our whole selves, mind, body, spirit.
Let me ask if you have a vision particularly for Cuban Americans. I have, you know, I wrote a book about 5 years ago. Don't want to get into that, except I have a subtitle, in one of my chapters. It is Justo Gonzalez saved my academic life. Because I was studying like you in this,
Right.
this ecosystem of whiteness,
Right.
trying to find that new Jesus we're talking about.
Right.
And I found his books, his history books, really.
Yeah, so
And
good.
even though in some ways he recited the same history that I was reading in my assigned books
Right.
and recommended books, his voice just gave it more authority and
Right.
was more penetrating. I think you know what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Justo Gonzalez, he's like my little abuelito. He's Cuban, American. I mean, well, he's Cuban too. So yeah, I totally know what you mean. So your question is,
A
can you
vision
repeat it? A
for
Cuban,
Cuban Americans and perhaps even
yeah.
Cubans.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a difficult and interesting question to answer, only because I think the history of Cuban peoples and Cuban Americans peoples is so complicated here in the US. I think what was so difficult for me to write this book is just how much Cuban Americans who are tied to the revolution, older generations, I mean, they really look to empire as a source of salvation, right? When they arrived to the States, many of them were welcomed the way that Haitians and Jamaicans and other, Caribbean folks were not. And they, because of the unique time in history, the Cold War and the fear of communism, it was the perfect, they were the perfect people to use and to the perfect people to indoctrinate and the perfect people, in here in the States. And so I really do believe that many Cuban Americans were just, propaganda was sold to them and they believed it and they still are. I mean, many are diehard, Republicans, and because of what they went through and the trauma many of them, not all of them, but many of them experienced. And so I think in Abuelita Faith, I'm trying to kind of, how do I say this? It's that complicated reality and look at it in a way of like, there's trauma, but there's also privilege, and it's just very, and especially a place like Miami where many Cubans were able to establish themselves and create this sort of utopia, their own utopia. And in that there is anti-Blackness, and in that there is, just so many things that is just so complicated to unravel because, again, as I said earlier, empire is all about the farce, the image that it creates, and so they buy into this idea of whiteness, but they leave their little haven of Miami, and they are nobodies, right? They are treated just as they are, just as every other Latino person would be treated in the world, and so, or in the rest of the country, and so. I think when it comes to a vision for Cuban Americans, I want to see Cuban Americans really step into this vision of liberation, because I think, if you read the Bible, so much of scripture is God telling Israel, don't be like your oppressors. I have liberated you so that you do not become like the oppressor. And I think that is a lot of the times that is what happens. I mean, we see this over and over and over again. The oppressed become the oppressor when they are given, because of empire, because empire is a farce and it believes that you must do this in order to be liberated or in order to be free or in order to, so anyway, I say all that to say that I see, and I see in a lot of the younger generation of Cuban Americans, there's hope. I want to see the Cuban peoples liberated, both on the island and here, right? I want to see them liberated, mind, body, spirit.
It's true for, as you just pointed out, for younger Cuban Americans and of other people groups. It's the younger people who see things that their forebears didn't see, but at the same time, there is an economic dependence on the older generation. And so it can be very costly for people of any ethnicity to follow their conscience. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah. Well, I think it is difficult. And I think from the way that I understand it and the way I see it in my community, there is a dependence. And I think there is, at the same time, there's just a lot of trauma, involved in the realities of different generations. I mean, carry their own different forms of trauma. And I think that particularly for the Cubans, it was a lot of economic trauma. I mean, many of them, even if they were not rich, my family was not rich. I mean, my abuelo came on a raft. He was one of the balseros that escaped Cuba and, came on a raft. And so, my family wasn't among the wealthy in Cuba who left. They were in the second wave that left, and he came first and then brought my family over. But there is a lot of economic trauma, and just what was happening, and, going from just being a person living in the world to all of a sudden, all this political unrest, feeling like you need to escape and leave and, find some sort of respite. You're gonna come, and then, like I said, it was the perfect time in history with it was all the propaganda, whatever, and all of a sudden you're going to see empire as a form of salvation, and I think that's what happened. In Abuelita's Faith, I write, this is what empire does. It puts people in vulnerable positions and then convinces them that only empire can save them from their vulnerability.
So let me ask, do you feel that played into your decision to, at least during that season in your life, drift away from your Roman Catholicism and move towards the white evangelical church? I think empire saves.
I mean, perhaps, it was in my consciousness without, really thinking about it consciously, right? It was there. But I think for me, it was just thinking of it in a spiritual sense. I think, looking for belonging and looking for, where I felt in my specific context, the younger generation. I wasn't speaking Spanish as my primary language when I got to college, when I got to, what I'm saying? And I'm stuck in this. And I think it happens a lot with children of immigrants. You find yourself sort of in between these two worlds. And I think that was, I was maybe finding myself in that place in between these two worlds, as someone who is Westernized and American, but also someone who's lived experience. It also belongs, in another place. I talk about in Abuelita Faith how Cuba lives within me. And this is something where I've never lived on the island, but the island lives in me. And so I'm living this sort of in between, and again, I do talk about it in Abuelita Faith of how, many of us who come from sort of these in between places, we feel like there's a sort of shame that the dominant culture might put on us to be someone of one place, right? We're shamed into feeling like we don't belong here or we don't belong there. And so therefore that's a place of shame. But what I argue in Abuelita Faith is like, well, what if this third place, what if this in-betweenness is sort of where we most engage with the divine? What if that is our spiritual superpower, right? That we are from here and from there. There's a Spanish saying that says, I'm not soy ni de aquí ni de allá. I'm not from here nor from there.
That's actually my byline on my social media.
Yeah. Right. It's a very, because many of us feel that way, right? And Abuelita Faith, I argue, well, what if I'm from de aquí and from de allá? Like, what if being from here and from there is my, like I said, my superpower? What if that is where, and I think but the dominant culture has so shamed us to think that, no, we need to be from here or from there, or we don't have, like, we're pulled in two directions. Yeah. But I think that, I want to reclaim that. And I want to reclaim this, like, no, we're both from here and from there. And that is beautiful. And that is sacred. And that is divine. And so anyways, to answer your question, I think I was feeling that pull, between these two worlds. And, it's been in my journey of decolonizing and deconstructing and all the things, I think I've began to reclaim that. And so now, I still hold on to some of the things that I in my Protestantism, I love the Bible, for example, that's something that is huge in Protestant faith. But I also love the sacraments, and I love, my altar, and I love the saints. And so I'm finding myself in this in between space. I'm finding, my spirituality there, and I'm finding my identity there, and I'm finding my full self in this in between space. And I think, I'm currently writing a paper right now on the widow who gives all of her money to the temple, and how she is like this othered hybrid person, this third space person. And, empire might marginalize her and suppress her in that third space. But I'm saying, well, what if in that third space is where her subversive, where her actions can be subversive, like her putting all her money into the temple treasury. What if that's a middle finger to the system, right? Like, what if her putting all her money in there, because she has to turn around and she takes from the temple fund because the temple has a widow's fund. So she's throwing in all her money to get some of it back, right? And so what if in that way that is her, sort of in a subversive sense, sticking her middle finger up to the system and saying, well, I'm going to, I'm going to mock the system by giving everything I have and then just taking it right back. And so I look at that, and I look at her as a middle third space in between person. And I say, yeah, what if those of us who live that sort of middle ground can reclaim this space and be subversive in this space? And, so maybe that was, a long-winded way to answer your question. I don't really know particularly what it was about evangelicalism that drew me. It might have been, the spectacle that drew me. But then in my coming back to myself, I think it's been a reclaiming of who who I am, the faith of my ancestors, and building my own third space, my own spirituality from that.
You also just answered my earlier question about secrets to consciousness, to raising collective consciousness. And when you talked about, when you used the phrase ni de aquí ni de allá, and finding your superpower there, I think that colonized populations everywhere are ascending to that, awareness that that we can embrace who we are, and for those of us who have a connection to Jesus in some way, we feel like this is who Jesus was always meant to be,
Right. Yeah.
This is the Jesus who is not from here or from there.
Yeah, totally.
Is gives us a connection, a superpower, if you will, right?
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that that's exactly it. I mean, Jesus was a middle third space other, right? In that sense. I mean, if you think of it fully divine and fully human, I mean, if you think, there's so many ways that Jesus is this hybrid identity, this like hybrid, living within empire, right? But also like speaking to and against empire and being subversive, I mean, if you read scripture through the lens of imperialism, I mean, so much of it is just like a middle finger to empire, right? And so I think that, that was Jesus's superpower, it was his in-betweenness. And I think for many of us, that is, that can be ours if we are so committed to reclaiming that.
So before we stop, Kat, and this has been just uplifting, but before we stop, you wrote Sacred Belonging, a 40-day devotional on the liberating heart of Scripture. Now, I don't even know if it's for me, but because I was so enchanted with the former book, I pre-ordered this book yesterday.
Oh, thank you.
Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah. So, this book is very different than my first book. This book it's a devotional, and I really wanted to write a devotional because there are no devotionals out there for those of us who, want to read scripture from a decolonized lens and want to think of the Bible in new and unique and fresh ways, but also don't necessarily, want to just take it day by day and have, read digestible chunks of text. And so I wanted to reclaim the devotional space. My publisher and I both did. And so, yeah, I wrote Sacred Belonging. It has 5 sections, the body, wisdom, spirit, nature, and the feminine. And I look at the Bible from those 5 perspectives, right? And so I ask questions about nature and women's bodies and bodies in general, and what different forms of wisdom, like the stars and the moon and things that in evangelicalism we've been told not to look to as sources of wisdom, but and I kind of point to scripture and say, hey, look, all of this is there. God told God's people to look to the moon for, all sorts of wisdom.
Oh, I'm
and look
getting
to
excited
the stars.
about this book.
And look to the stars for all sorts of wisdom, and even animals and plants and creation. And so, yeah, so I'm just, so I just wrote 40 essays. It's a 40-day, devotional, but you can read it as you wish, however you wish. And it was a fun project. It was difficult, but it was fun.
Maybe this is the book for those who observe Lent, to help them make their way through. I've been off and on reading. There's a devotional guide called Psalms for Black Lives by Gabby Cujo-Wilkes and Andrew Wilkes.
Amazing.
A New York couple. And I found it so uplifting to hear through their pens, an interpretation of the Psalms, that I couldn't find anywhere else. And it sounds like, this book, Sacred Belonging, will give me something that I can share with other folks. I can see myself at some point, sharing your book as a gift with other people to find their way through Lent or through whatever they're dealing with.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I hope so. I hope you, can glean from it and share it. And, like I said, it was a fun project to write because I wrote about, all sorts of things. Like I said, the moon, the stars, all sorts of interesting and different things. And again, looking to, the wisdom in scripture that kind of points us to all of these things that we haven't been trained to look.
Thank you. And thank you for giving us some of your time. Our goal here is to connect people who have emerged from various kinds of dogmatism, who have been indoctrinated in ways that have been unhealthy for them, and perhaps have even, to some extent, ruined their lives or their families. And so this is why we have Kat Armas on here today. And I look forward to hearing, Kat, if you're ever in Santa Barbara, Diane and I can have your family over, or we can all go to a restaurant. I know people like to come to Santa Barbara. So now that you have a landing spot.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That means so much. Yeah. I lived in LA for a few years, and, my husband and I love it out there. And we would go to Santa Barbara all the time because it's just such a great, little sweet town. So just nice. So yeah, I will definitely let you know, take you up on that offer.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here today. We are people who have left behind performance-based religion and the shame that comes with it. Maybe you have a personal liberation story to tell, and we want to know about it. Please contact us on Twitter at God is not an asshole, or text 805-703-8393, because the world needs to know that God is not an asshole.